Evening, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar, explaining the South Australian Sire Evaluation results. My name is Jodie Rizzo O'Brien, and I'm part of the Sheep Connect team. Sheep Connect is supported through funding from Australian Wool Innovation, the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund, and the Department of Primary Industries and Regions. If you want to know more about Sheep Connect, click on our website, sheepconnectsa.com.au, and we welcome you to follow us on Twitter. We've got two speakers tonight. Our first is Ben Swain, and our second speaker is Bill Burgess. At this time, I'll introduce Ben. Ben has worked in agribusiness since graduating from wool and pastoral science with honours from the University of New South Wales. Then he worked for 6 years with Australian Wool Exchange, and then he progressed through various positions, conducting time as operations manager. In 2002, Ben commenced the operations of BCS Agribusiness, and he has been running the business as a full-time operation ever since. Ben's also a manager of his own commercial beef and sheep property near Gunnedah in New South Wales. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Jodie. And so as Jodie mentioned, my name's Ben Swain, and I'm the Executive Officer of the Sire Evaluation Association. And my role tonight is I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to just give a bit of a background about Sire Evaluation and what it tries to achieve and how it does it. I notice a few names on the participants list that I see around a lot of Sire Evaluation field days and meetings. So you'll probably know everything that I'm going to tell you, but I also see lots of people there that may not be quite up to speed with how Sire Evaluation works. So we're just going to spend a little bit of time looking at what it's all about, but then we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of the results from the South Australian 2020 trial. So we'll do that second. So just kicking off, so what's this all about? So Sire Evaluation started in 1989. It's the longest running genetic evaluation program in the world of any livestock species. It's all about evaluating a sire's potential genetic performance through its progeny. And we'll look a little bit at that later on how that works. It's really important that Merino Sire Evaluation operates across a range of environments. And I've got a map that I'll show you later about where all the sites are. It's self-funded by sire entrants. So there's lots of entrants in the audience tonight, and you've all put up money to enter your sire in these trials, and that's how Sire Evaluation works. There's 120 odd rams entered every year in Sire Evaluation, and they're all funded through entrants. And importantly, the whole program is overseen by the association, which is AMSEA, and AMSEA is funded by AWI. So a big thanks to AWI for its continuing help of Sire Evaluation, which actually stems all the way back to 2005. So just quickly, why would people be involved in Sire Evaluation and what's in it? So for ram breeders, it's really about benchmarking their genetics against the best genetics that are out there in the industry. We all know in any business, if we don't benchmark, if we don't compare and compete with people in the same industry, that making gains fairly tough. So Sire Evaluation is a really good way to be able to benchmark against others. Importantly, it's a really important way that stud breeders can gain linkage in Merino Select. And I won't dwell on the technicalities of linkage tonight, but if you want to be a Merino Select member and you want to generate Australian sheep breeding values on your animals, you need to be linked in the database, and putting a ram in Sire Evaluation is a key role of that. Obviously, commercially, we're all here to make money, promoting semen, stud rams, flock ram sales. If you've got a ram that performs well in Sire Evaluation, which you'll see a few later on tonight, you're definitely going to benefit commercially from that. But what about ram buyers? So there's lots of ram breeders obviously in the audience, but I also see some buyers there, and it's equally important that the program's got equal amount of benefits to ram buyers as well. And that's really about seeing how genetics operate, or how genetics are applied in particular environments. Genetic by environment is a term that's used quite a lot in genetics, and it's a really important part of sheep breeding, because we all know that different genetics plays out differently in different environments. So it's one thing to see how how a ram performs in its own environment and its own flock at the stud, but it's a very different thing to see how that ram or how those genetics play out in another environment that may or may not be more closely related to yours. And exactly the same for how those rams go joined to a particular ewe type. Unfortunately, when we go and buy rams, we don't necessarily take them home and join them to exactly the same ewes that the stud breeder does. So it's a really important part of sire evaluation to cross those genetics of those sires over different ewe types and allow ram buyers to be able to evaluate the outcome of that. There's some South Australian sheep from, I think, last year's field day. So I guess the big benefit of sire evaluation for everyone is just being able to see sheep. You can go along to field days. Unfortunately, we couldn't this year, of course, in South Australia, but being able to get our hands on the sheep, you can see all the sheep there split up into their sire groups. Being able to get our hands on the sheep, have a look at the data, have a look at the results all at one stop shop in a particular environment's, a huge benefit of the program. So I mentioned there's lots of sites across Australia. Wherever pretty much you run merinos in Australia, you'll find a site not too far from it. They're very diverse environments and very diverse climates, as you would expect right across the country. Each site has their own breeding objective, so which makes sense because most breeders have their own breeding objective, and that breeding objective is important when we start talking about classing the progeny. They're all locally managed and funded, as I say, and they're run on a mixture of commercial properties, as is in the case in South Australia. Educational institutes and research organisations all host these properties around Australia. A couple of interesting ones. The New England site over here in New South Wales is the oldest running site. It started in 1989. It was the foundation site. And the Yardstick site, which is the Western Australian site at Katanning, has operated every year since 1993. So you can see there the longevity in this program. And there's people that are still involved in the program today that entered rams in those very first trials at those couple of sites. So that's where the sites are, just to give you an idea of the environmental diversity around Australia. You can see there's sites right across the country. You can see the South Australian site, which obviously moves around different sites in South Australia, but is there. Interesting, you'll see a new Dooney site in the Riverina of New South Wales. So that's only just come on board with its first joining this year, and that'll be a really interesting site because they're joined, obviously predominantly Dooney rams joined to a commercial Dooney ewe flock, but we've also got 3 Merino link sires in there that have been used at other sire evaluation programs just to benchmark those Dooneys against the Merinos. So it'd be a really fascinating trial, that one. We've also had historically sites in both Queensland and Tasmania. They're currently not operating. We hope to soon get those sites back up and running, and anywhere else that there's interest in a site, we'll work with people to get them going as well. So how does sire evaluation work for those of you that might be new to sire evaluation or haven't been along to a field day to see how it works? So each site joins between 12 and 20 sires. Including these link sires, and these link sires are joined across multiple sites. It allows us to link all the data together, and we'll get to that when we start talking about the results. They're joined through artificial insemination. Obviously, we don't have the sires on site. They're scattered all around Australia in their homes or in their own properties or AI centres, but we join them through AI to a minimum of 50 ewes per sire. Some sites are joining more than 50. Some sites are joining up to 70 or 80, and that just depends on what they want to do with the progeny and the traits that they want to measure. Those ewes, it's really important when we select sites that being a site host is a fairly onerous task, and one of the first hurdles that a site host has to do is to be able to provide the program a very even class line of ewes that are typical to that region or that environment. And by that we mean They don't necessarily have to be the best ewes in the world. They can't be the worst ewes, but they've just got to be even. So when the rams are joined to their 50 ewes through AI, all of those rams are getting an equal chance of getting an equal quality of ewes. So it's not an easy task to find sites that can run these programs, but luckily enough, for 30 odd years, we've been able to do it. Those are lamb progeny that result. So if we're joining 50 odd ewes, we should be getting anywhere between 40 and 50, 60 lambs on the ground. Those lambs are run for their entire period of the trial, which is anywhere from sort of 18 months to 2 years. They're run as one mob, and they're run identically, and they're assessed for all the same traits, measured for all the same traits, and classed all the same way. So it's really important that those sheep will run as what we call one management group, which allows the direct comparison of those sires where they started. So a lot of people say, well, why do you need to assess the progeny? Why don't we just look at the ram, and why don't we just measure the ram? And I guess simply, if we only measure the ram, well, we only get the information on the ram's own performance. We only get what his micron is, what his body weight is, what his fleece weight is. And a lot of that's obviously influenced by the environment that ram lives in. By assessing the ram itself, we're not getting a true comparison of that ram's genetic potential. The only way that we can do that is to take the genes from that ram out of the ram and put them into the progeny and manage those progeny the same way and evaluate those progeny. Which is why the progeny are the key. So it's why Merino Sire Evaluation is also called the central test sire evaluation, or the Merino progeny trials. So everything that we measure, everything that we do in sire evaluation is all about the progeny of those rams. I guess another way of looking at that is when we look at a sheep, a ram, or when we look at any sort of an animal, ourselves included, what we're seeing is a combination of a whole range of things that have led us to look the way we do, or that animal to look the way we do. So we've got things like environment. Obviously, if they're running in a really good environment, they'll be bigger, they'll cut more wool, they'll have a higher fiber diameter. Disease and parasites, if they're full of worm, they're going to look different. If they've got poor nutrition, there's a range of environmental issues, not the least of whether you're born a single or a twin. Some of those birth effects we call environments as well. And they'll all have a pretty significant impact on what that animal looks like. So in sire evaluation, we measure the progeny, which takes away all of the environmental effects, which leaves us only the genetics. So we're able to compare these 12 to 20 sires that are entered in each trial purely based on their genetics by looking and measuring and visually classing the progeny of those sires. So what is assessed? There's a list a mile long, and before we look at the results, we'll just get our head around what are the sort of things that we're assessing, because we don't have time to go through all the results tonight, but there's a plethora of traits that we assess. So let's start with the measured traits. So wool traits, all the general sort of wool traits that we measure. Staple length and staple strength, of course. Not all flocks are measuring staple length and strength, but not all on-farm flocks. Obviously, it's an expensive measurement to take. All sire evaluation flocks measure staple length and strength. Carcass, body weight, eye muscle depth and fat, all measured at every sire evaluation site every year. Other traits such as worm egg count. Not all sites can always get a worm egg count because of the environment that some of those sites operate in. And over the last 3 or 4 years, it's been particularly difficult to get worm egg counts high enough to be able to get the variation that we need to make meaningful outcomes with. But all sites endeavour to get a worm egg count if they can. So they're the measured traits, but what about the visual traits? Each sheep in sire evaluation is visually assessed for a huge range of traits, and we actually collect more visual data on the animals than we do measured traits, which a lot of people don't realise. We spend a lot of time doing exactly what's on the screen. There are a couple of classes assessing a range of traits, and some poor bugger that in this case is me standing next to them, recording all that information as they do it. So the sort of things that we score: wool colour, wool character, structure, pigmentation, fleece, flock, staple weathering, dust, a whole range of traits that most of you would be familiar with. Conformation traits as well, such as wrinkle, jaw, face, back and shoulder conformation, legs and feet. Breech is obviously a really important part of sire evaluation. The breech scoring system started at sire evaluation many years ago, and the sire evaluation data was the data that was used to establish the current Australian sheep breeding values for breech traits. So it's been an important part of sire evaluation for a long time, as is DAG and urine scoring. So lots of traits there that are individually on every animal scored in every trial. We also score a classes grade on every animal. So an independent class that comes in and gives each of these progeny a classes grade, which is a top flock or a cull, just like you would in your own commercial flock. And that's based on the site's breeding objective. So I mentioned earlier, each site has their own breeding objective, and that breeding objective is set by the local site committee. And it's representative of the typical breeding objective that might be apparent in that location or that environment. So local sheep breeders should be able to relate to the breeding objective, and the breeding objective might be things like to produce a dual purpose type sheep that cuts 6 kilos of wool at 19 micron and rears 120% of lambs, something along those lines. And every site's going to have a different breeding objective, and the classer that comes in classes to that breeding objective and splits them up, as I was saying, to top, flock and cull. So the visual sheep scores, that's how we do all of those traits. I hope many of you have seen a copy of the visual sheep scores published by AWI and MLA. They include all the traits that we score, and stud breeders can also score those traits and submit many of them to Sheep Genetics. And there is an ever-growing list of visual trait ASBVs, or Australian sheep breeding values, that are being published by Sheep Genetics, and they all rely on data being submitted by sheep breeders. So when a progeny is assessed, the only one I'm going to focus on here is that one down there, which is the hogget. So at each of our 10 sites around Australia, the site committees decide on what their assessment looks like. They can assess them as twice, they can assess them once, they can assess them, whatever they like, as long as it fits in with the AMSEA requirements. The South Australian 2020 drop trial, which is we're going to have a look at the results tonight, was a hogget assessment. So that means that all the wool measurements, the carcass measurements, they were both done at the hogget stage. Carcass was done at the yearling stage. Worm egg count, unfortunately, we didn't get high enough to get results. It would have been done at the yearling stage if we could have. And then we do a range of visual scores, starting at marking, going all the way through to off shears. Okay, so moving on to the results section, I hope most people now have got a little bit of an understanding about how sire evaluation works and where it's come from, and a bit of background to it. So now let's look at the results. So we're going to look at where to find these results and how to read them, with a special focus obviously on the South Australian 2020 drop report, which was released back in July. Okay, so site report. So this is what we're going to be focusing on tonight. Here's the South Australian site report. It's the hogget assessment. Now, site reports are within drop. Only results from the local trial, in this case, your local South Australian trial, are included in these results. They're only within that drop. Plenty of sites have 2 drops running, as is the case in South Australia, so where there was a 19 drop and a 20 drop running on the same property. These site reports are only one drop. They're drop specific, they're site specific. They can be multiple, they can include multiple assessments. So this hogget assessment will include all the data all the way from when the lambs were tagged at tagging right through to when they were shorn as hoggets. Field days is also obviously another place to get results. Unfortunately, no field day this year. It's the best place to go and get results because you get to see the sheep. And the most important bit about sire evaluation is getting your hands on the sheep. We also do lots of site updates, so keep your eye out for those as we go as well. So there's site reports, and that's what we'll be looking at tonight. We've also got a publication called Merino Superior Sires, and this is hot off the press. Well, it's actually not even off the press yet. It's actually on the press at the moment. It was finalised today, and it will be released later this week, pending a couple of approvals, as we all know we have to do. So Merino Superior Sires combines all of the sites across Australia together into one report using Australian sheep breeding values. So that means the results in there, they're across year and across drop. They include all the data that we collect, and we publish that once a year. It's also got classing results in there, and you can find that at merinosuperiorSires.com.au. Sheep genetics is also a really important place to find sire evaluation data. Obviously on sheep genetics, you'll find ASBVs, and sire evaluation is a major contributor to the data in sheep genetics. Obviously, all the data collected at sire evaluation gets shooted off to sheep genetics and adds to the data in sheep genetics. The guys at Sheep Genetics have recently, it's a little while ago now, just redeveloped their website. If you haven't been there, you should jump on and have a look. It's a great tool to go and find specific sheep based on individual animals, or you can search by criteria. And one of the things we really like about it is that you can search by rams that are in Merino Superior Sires, which is great. So you can jump on there and have a look at the current ASBVs for all rams that have been in Merino Superior Sires. Okay, types of results. We report lots of data in Merino Superior Sires or in sire evaluation. Just before we start looking at the results, it's important that you understand what we're looking at. So raw data, everyone knows what raw data is. It's as you record them. If you pick up a fleece in a shearing shed and drop it on the scales and it weighs 6.5 kilos, that's raw data. We don't do any adjustments to them, which is what we do to adjusted sire means. And we're going to look at adjusted sire means tonight. And they're one of the main sources of results that we use in sire evaluation. And what they do is we take the raw data and we adjust that data for non-genetic effectors that affect the production. The obvious ones are birth type and rare type. If you're born as a twin or born as a single, you will have different production outcomes than if you weren't. Keeping in mind that these sire evaluation trials are based on AI programs, and those AI programs result in quite a range of birth types in those sire groups. We get sire groups with lots of twins, and we get sire groups with not many twins, and none of that's genetic. That's simply a matter of it's simply a function of the AI program. So it's important that we adjust for that birth type and the rare type and all those other things you see there, whether there's lots of weathers or lots of ewes in the group, to bring a level playing field. We had a really interesting example of one of our Western Australian sites this year that one ram had 80% of the lambs were born as twins, and one ram had 30% born as twins. And to look at those two sire groups penned up side by side at the field day, you'd walk straight past the ram that had all these little twins in the pen, because they looked small, they looked light cutting. They just didn't look like the sort of sheep that were in the pen next to them, but they were only young at the field day, and if we hadn't adjusted for those non-genetic factors, it would have really disadvantaged that sire with lots of twins. The next level of results that we've got are flock breeding values, and we've touched on these already, but these is what we report in the reports, and they take the adjusted sire means and they further improve the accuracy of them by adjusting them for heritability. Some traits like fibre-diameter are highly heritable versus other traits like reproduction are lowly heritable. So we overlay the heritability of the trait as well as the correlation between other traits. So we know that there's a correlation, for example, between fleece weight and body weight. We can use the information that we know about those correlations to adjust the flock breeding value, or any breeding value for that matter. Flock breeding values in sire evaluation world are by far the most accurate assessment of a sire's progeny performance. They take out all of the environment and leave just the genetics. As I said, flock breeding values, we can only compare within a flock. So when we're looking at a site report, we can only compare the information within that report, those rams within that report. When we go to Australian sheep breeding values, we can compare across flocks. And that's what we publish in Merino Superior Sires. So just keep in mind when you're looking at sire evaluation reports or sheep genetics reports, what you're actually looking at. There's a really important difference between within flock breeding values and across flock breeding values. Okay, South Australian site report. So here it is again. If you haven't seen the South Australian site report, we've popped it up on the website again today as the top report on the latest update. So if you go to merinosuperiorSires.com.au, you'll see right up here in the latest updates where the blue circle is, you'll see the report that you can just simply click on that and download it. If you haven't done that, I'd really encourage you to do it. There's some really interesting results in here that we'll have a look at. But that's what the report looks like on the front cover. It's 20-something pages long, and we'll have a bit of a look through it. Before we do, though, a bit of a shout out or acknowledgement to the site sponsors. As I mentioned, all of these sites are self-funded. AWI funds AMSEA, which is really my role, and also funds the link sires that we use to link all the trials together. But without the sponsors that kick this trial into gear, these sites wouldn't be happening, and particularly in South Australia, without Merino SA, which is the administration body, if you like, that runs this trial and sends out all the invoices and runs the committee and all those sort of things. Without Merino SA, this trial definitely wouldn't happen. So a huge thanks to Merino SA and all the other site sponsors that are listed there in front of you. Righto, raw data. So we talked about raw data, we talked about adjusted sire means, and we talked about flock breeding value. So we're going to go through them in that same order. So here's some raw data, which is how we publish. This is on page 27. So down the left-hand side, we've got all the rams that are in the trial. You'll see some familiar names there, and we've got the results. So just looking quickly at what we're looking at here, these are the breech visual traits. So these are scored on every animal at marking for breech cover and breech wrinkle. You can see that there. And what we do is down the bottom, we put the average performance. So you can see the average score of this whole drop was 1.5 breech wrinkle, which is very plain. If you think of one as no wrinkle, these are very plain sheep. And you'll see the distribution of the various scores from 1 through to 5 there as well. The blue squares highlight the trait leaders, and you'll see in this case, I've picked on the Shilara pole ram, but there are in fact multiple trait leaders that are all 0.3 of a score lower than the average. So they would have a breech wrinkle score of 1.2. And that is repeated throughout the report. Blues are trait leaders, and we show them as deviation. So I won't go through all the visual traits, obviously, or we'd be here till midnight, but you can read them all the same way. So I've picked on breech wrinkle because obviously a lot of breeders are interested in breech wrinkle. I certainly am. And you can see some rams there that are performed well for breech wrinkle, and you can see some rams there that are on the wrinklier side of the average. So an interesting outcome of the trial. Let's look at adjusted sire means. Now, remember, these are the ones that are measured traits that are adjusted for whether you're born as a single or a twin, and what sex you are and all that sort of thing. So again, you'll see the sires down the left-hand side, and you'll see all of the traits across the top. So here we've got greasy fleece weight, which is measured in kilos and is measured at the Hoggett stage, which is the H. Down the bottom, you'll see that they average 6.1 kilos. Now, that's the progeny group average, not adjusted. That's just the average of all the progeny in the trial. And you'll see the individual sire groups are listed there as to what they cut. So a couple of trait leaders there, the Glenville Pole ram and the Hazeldean ram are the two trait leaders for fleece weight, cutting 6.5 kilos and 6.7 respectively. So you can see there, they're cutting about 10% or so more kilos of wool on an adjusted sire means basis than the average. So as to be expected by those couple of rams, knew they were the high fleece weight rams, and that's exactly how they've performed in the trial. You can do the same for all the fibre, for all the traits. Fibre diameter, obviously, we're looking for the low one. And there we've got the trait leader at 15.9 for fibre diameter. But you can see the big range there in all of these traits, which shows, within even those 18 rams, and a lot of them South Australian based, obviously, there's some big range in the genetics that come out. Weight's a really interesting one. You can see there that the weights for these progeny were assessed at multiple stages, weaning, obviously, post-weaning, yearling, and Hoggett, which is the across the top there. And you can see that sometimes there's consistency. The Glenville pole ram, again, is a trait leader, big, heavy cutting sheep. And he's been a trait leader right the way through. Which is interesting because we don't always see that. We'll often see rams that bounce out of the gate. Say, for example, the old Ashrose pole ram down the bottom here, which is one of the link sires in this trial, bounced out of the gate, was the trait leader at weaning. And then he's certainly still above average at post-weaning, but then coming back more to average at yearling and Hoggett. We often see that. We often see the reverse, such as the Pepperwell pole ram that wasn't a trait leader at weaning and at the Hoggett stage is now a trait leader. So it's interesting how the different genetics is expressed in this environment. Some are slower maturing, some are later maturing, and depending on what your breeding objective is and what you're trying to achieve in your flock, you'll probably be looking for different things there. The other adjusted sire means report is the class's visual grade. We talked about the tops, flocks, and culls. Now here, this is where our independent classes classes each of these sheep and puts them in a top, flock, and cull. And these are presented as percentage deviations from the drop average. So we can see down the bottom there, we had 20% tops and 24% culls, which is pretty much spot on as to what we're looking for. And you can see there that these animals vary enormously in how many tops they produce and how many culls. So there's our tops and culls as a percentage. Now, if we look at those couple of rams up there, plus 19, we'd say that. So those rams have produced 19% more tops than the average. So if the average is 20, these sheep have produced 39% of their progeny being classed as tops. So an outstanding performance. What we want to do that is match that with a negative culls result. So we're looking for rams that produce less culls than average, in case that the Mumblebone ram here, who has produced minus 10 or 10% less culls than average, which in this case would be 14. What we really want to see is like the Caribbean ram up the top there that's produced positive tops and negative culls. That's what we want to see when we're classing sheep. Lots of top sheep, very few cull sheep. And you see that's fairly repeatable. The Ramsgate poll's done the same. Ramsgate ram, I should say, sorry, positive 13 and minus 6. So they're rams. If we look for the positives in the left and the negatives in the right, they're the sort of rams that visually have met the breeding objective of the site, which I won't dwell on, but you'll find in the site report. Let's look at flock breeding values. So these take the adjusted sire means and turn them into flock breeding values, as I say, by adding heritabilities and correlations. Now, you'll see lots of similarities in the results, and that's because sire evaluation trials are so tightly managed in terms of they're all AI lambs, so they're all only born over 10 days. So there's lots of consistency, which means we don't see huge changes with the flock breeding values, but they still are certainly the most accurate. So again, we see the traits up the top. and the units that they're measured in and the stage of which they're measured, this being a Hoggett trial. So you see all the H's. And you'll see here the Hazeldean ram is the trait leader for fleece weight, both greasy fleece weight and clean fleece weight, based on flock breeding values. Now, the way we look at this, you'll see positives and negatives. So you want to be positive for things like fleece weight and body weight and anything you want more of. And we want to be negative for traits that we want less of, like fibre diameter. And when I say you want to be, that's if your breeding objective is driving you that way. If you want to decrease fibre diameter, which not all of us do, but if you want to decrease fibre diameter, you need to look at that as negative fibre diameter. But let's look at, just stick on the fleece weight. We look at this Hazeldean ram, he's 25% for clean fleece weight. So we expect the progeny of that ram to be 25% more clean fleece weight than the average. So that's quite a big range when we look at the top ram at 25 and the bottom ram at -24. There's quite a significant range in fleece weight, in genetic fleece weight potential in this trial. And you can see exactly the same for fibre diameter, where the Cow-Kookaburra ram is the trait leader for fibre diameter at -2.2, and you can see some rams there at plus 1.9, I think, is the Collinsville pole ram, which is actually a link ram that we've put in there to link the trials together. So again, huge range in this trial of these really important production traits. Staple length, which is a really interesting trait for me, because we're seeing some extreme staple length right around the Merino job at the moment. Lots of people are really pushing that staple length as they head towards 6 monthly shearing or even 9 monthly shearing. And you can see the ram there on the top that's 20 millimeters, so plus 20. So we'd expect the progeny there to produce 20 millimeters more wool in that 12-month growing period than average. So an extremely long staple. Staple strength exactly the same, lots of variation. When we look at the weights, we see similar to what we saw when we looked at the adjusted sire means, which is not always the case. We see these weights across these stages of weaning, post-weaning, yearling, and Hoggett repeating themselves. So again, the Glenville pole ram, obviously genetically the biggest sheep in that trial, has been at the top of the trait leaders for weight since weaning, and is getting bigger in comparison to the other progeny as they've gone on. As I said, we don't always see that. We do tend to see rams that early, maybe more early maturing and then come back to the average. But we've got a couple of rams there that have stayed right up the top. Fat and muscle, obviously a really important trait as well there. And we see the mumblebone ram not unexpectedly being the trait leader for both fat and muscle on a breeding value basis, which is good for us New South Wales people to get a ram there that's tipped you guys over a bit. You saw, I mentioned before that we couldn't measure WEC, unfortunately. A good thing for the site hosts, of course, that they didn't have wormy sheep, but we like to see WEC measured because it's a really important trait for a lot of our entrants. Indexes. Indexes, for those of you that aren't familiar, I'm pretty sure most of you would be, combine all of the traits into a combination of traits for a production system, and those production systems are listed up the top. So whether you're producing a dual purpose type animal focused on merino production, or fibre production, being a fine wool production, or wool production, which is similar to merino production, just more wool, you've got an index there that suits your breeding objective, and we combine the traits that are important in those production systems into a single digit number. And people, myself included, like to use indexes as bits of drafting gates. So we might look at the index as a way of saying, well, what rams are going to suit my production system, and then go and look at the individual traits. And here we've got these two rams again, the Glenville pole ram and the Karen Boone ram, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. The trait leaders for all four indexes. Now that is pretty rare. for a ram to be a trait leader, and in the case of the Glenville pole ram, he's actually the top ram on 3 of the 4 trait indexes. It's rare for rams to be a trait leader for all those indexes. And when you think about it, that sort of makes sense. You know, we've got a dual purpose index. It's all about reproduction and carcass and, you know, producing heaps of lambs and getting them to weight early. And the other end of the spectrum, you've got a fiber production index, which is all about producing, you know, quality wool in a tough environment that's probably full of worms and high rainfall. So for a ram to have the balance of traits, that's the trait leader on both of those indexes, and we've got 2 of them there. It's really interesting to see that there's rams out there that can achieve you know, really good outcomes across multiple indexes, which means they're performing really well for all traits, which is great to see. And we're seeing more and more of these type of rams come through sire evaluation, and of course those rams are being heavily used in the industry, and they're the rams that are really making genetic gain in the merino business a fact. Skipping on, because I've probably just about run out of time. I think I have. So quickly, just merino superior size. What's it look like? Well, this is what it looks like. Go online and have a look. These are all ASBVs, and they list all the rams for all the traits that you can imagine. Same deal though. Look for the trait leaders with the blue squares. They're the top 10%. And they've got some really interesting things in them as well that you can't find anywhere else, like the tops and culls, which is the classes grade across all the sites though. So that's a combined analysis. So that's, you know, it's really, you know, it's great. You know, being able to use link size at sire evaluation allows us to compare the visual performance of sheep across those 10 environments. And that's a really great piece of technology, I tend to think. Over there, it shows you how many sites have been used in, which is really interesting because it leads on to my my final slide, which I'll get to in just a minute. But we also have top 50s in there, which if you're interested in the MP Plus index, for example, we list the top 50 rams in sire evaluation by index. So there's the MP Plus, the Merino Production Index, which the Woody Arup ram currently, or last year, as of tomorrow he may not, but he was sitting on the top of that. This is the final thing that I want to show you, which I find really interesting. These are the high use sires, and you should jump on and download this because this lists the top 25 rams that have ever been entered in sire evaluation that have been used the most in the industry. So here we've got the Hazeldean ram at the top there that's been used in 26 flocks and produced almost 5,500 progeny. And if you look at why, you might say it's because he's a trait leader on all 4 indexes. And that may be one reason. It may be because he's a high fleece weight ram and a low fibre diameter lamb with lots of reproduction. But there's plenty of reasons there for people to be using that ram, and they certainly have. So it's a really interesting report. Those 25 sires have sired 46,000 progeny. So you can see these sires that have performed well in sire evaluation go on to have a major impact on the industry. So you know, and I reckon there's a couple of rams in this 2020 trial at South Australia that we'll see do exactly that over the coming years. I'm going to skip over that because I've run out of time. But just the final note: getting involved, enter a ram, join a site committee, turn up to a field day. There's heaps of ways that you can. That you can get involved, and jump on the website and have a look. And if you've got any questions, give us a bell and we'll hopefully answer them. Thanks, Jody. That's me.
Thanks, Ben. A couple of questions come in, and encourage people, if you've got a question, pop them in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and I'll pose those to Ben. And I think your last point about the accuracy and the amount of data from the sire evaluation, Ben, leads nicely into our first question, which is about, does sheep genetics actually put more emphasis on these results in sheep genetics because we've got such accurate data from what you're saying? No, they don't. All data is good data to sheep genetics, and that's reasonable. You know, there's been some discussion around, and
there's probably people that know more about it than me, so I probably shouldn't go into too much detail about having data quality standards in programs like sheep genetics, where different contributing flocks would be ranked on their data quality, and they might be weighted differently. But that's all talk at the moment. So at the moment, no, all data is treated the same, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people really like the within flock site reports that we publish, because there's no noise in those reports. It's all about it only uses the sire evaluation data. It's just about the results from that trial from those sheep. There's no on-farm data which can be making the results a bit noisy. So that's why we like to give a couple of options.
Cheers. Our second question is, you talked a lot about scores, and we've got sort of classes, tops and culls, and how do you make sure that none of those scores are biased towards a certain sire?
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess we do that a few ways. One is that we use independent classes. So obviously everything that's scored or measured or assessed in sire evaluation is done independently. We don't ask the entrants to come along and class their own sheep. But what's more importantly is everything is done randomly and blind. So there's no identification on any of these progeny as to who their sire is. They're all just tagged in a simple random order, the same order they come across the marking table. They're tagged in that order, or the same color tag. There's no different colors tags for different sire groups. So it's completely random up the race as they're presented. Classes got no idea who's who. And that ensures that independence and that robustness.
Thanks for that, Ben. We might move on to our second speaker, Bill. But if people have got some questions for Ben, please chuck them in the pop them in the chat box or in the Q&A, and we'll pose those to Ben at the end. So thanks so much for that, Ben. Our second speaker today is Bill Burgess from Weatherbys Scientific. Bill joined the Weatherbys team in August 2019 as the Australian and New Zealand Business Development Manager. He has extensive corporate and practical experience in the Australian and South Australian agricultural industry, and is responsible for leading commercial activities of Weatherbys Scientific in both Australia and New Zealand. At this time, I'll hand over to Bill. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Jody, and thank you, Ben, for running us through all of that. Lovely. So I know it's starting to get a little bit on in the night. I promise I won't keep you all too much longer. I just like to quickly run through who I am, who Weatherbys is, and what we've done. So I think Jody's probably given me a pretty good introduction thus far. I'm a local South Aussie here. I live in the Barossa Valley and really keen to support the sire evaluation site here in South Australia. I have grown up with Merino sheep, so it's a little bit close to home. It's nice to be involved. Weatherbys Scientific Australia, so we're relatively new business to Australia, quite an old business internationally, and we're offering genetic services to sheep and cattle here in ANZ. So for the sire evaluation site, we have done some 50-gauge genomic testing and some parentage analysis. Before I run into what we've done and how we've done it, I'd just like to cover off a slide which is a really good overview and echoes a lot on some of the points that Ben has mentioned about environment versus genetics. I find it's really surprisingly easy to get confused about which traits are controlled by environment, which traits are controlled by genetics. And I find this to be a really good way to just set your mind in the right space so that we all understand which way we're analysing these various traits. I like to think of DNA as the boundaries of performance, if you will. Your DNA is programmed into you. It's set from the day you're born. It doesn't change, and your performance over your lifetime will vary somewhere within the bounds of that DNA. Your environment, however, can obviously be changed and manipulated as life goes on. So at a high level, some really good, strong genetics can still do very well in most environments. Take our example on the left, that could be a far northern South Australian merino producer. Got some good looking sheep there, not a lot of feed, they can still do quite well. The other extreme, admittedly not a merino in this photo, would be really poor genetics can struggle in most environments. A great way to differentiate where your genetics or your DNA makes a difference is looking at those two environments. Imagine we had identical twins and split them into two different environments. The DNA would be consistent. The performance of those two animals would be very different because of their environment. So that in mind, to help analyze all of the results and particularly the ASBVs that have come out for the Merino Sire Evaluation site, we have run a 50K genomic test for all of the progeny born. So what happened from a Weatherbys point of view was I received a series of Allflex TSU tags, which were identified with essentially a birth number. I had no way of knowing which rams they belonged to. I had no way of knowing anything other than the order of birth and the site at which they were born. We took those samples back through our lab, turned them into 50K genomic profiles and put them into sheep genetics. We offer this same service for all ovine clients in Australia and then again for bovine. As the samples come to us, the process that actually runs through our lab, what we're actually doing is initial sample receipt. So we're quality controlled that you told us you were sending 100 samples, we've received 100 samples, the IDs all line up and that we've got things in the correct order. We then have a certain level of sample prep and organization, which runs into our DNA extraction process. Once we've extracted some DNA from the initial sample, we actually cap and seal the original sample so that it can be used at a later date if required. And the DNA that's extracted runs into our genotyping process. The genotyping itself of the whole process here is actually relatively simple. It only takes a few days. It's partaken in, obviously, a clean lab environment. It's very highly controlled, but as a step in the process, it is surprisingly one of the easier. The results that come out, not being the geneticist myself, but being a businessman and someone that grew up on the farm, I like to think of as computer code. It's ones and zeros, it's numbers, it's basically a DNA map, if you will. We put that DNA through a series of quality control measures, and we ensure that we haven't had any slip-ups during our lab process. We ensure the simple quality control, like the number of samples in is the number of 50K genotypes out. From that point, once it ticks all of our control measures, it runs through our data analysis team, who are analyzing the data for the results requested by the client. Some simple scenarios might be something like a pole horn result. They will read a homozygous, heterozygous pole horn marker from the DNA result. And then our final step in the chain is we have our data reporting. Now that can vary a little bit on client and can vary a little bit on the scenario in which we're working. Specifically here for the Merino Sire Evaluation site, our data reporting was through to the data analysis team at Sheep Genetics. So where does the genomics fit in your business or in any business for that matter is really, I suppose, the big question for a lot of people. And I'm sure given the fact that you're even on this call tonight, there's a certain level of phenotypic data collection in your own flock. There's certainly a very large level of phenotypic data collection through the various sire evaluation sites, as Ben's run us through. That phenotypic data coupled with a genetic sample gives us the ability to create some genomic data and then enhance the accuracy of a genomic evaluation. So the first and easiest thing that we can do and we can prove is parentage, knowing exactly which lambs came from which rams, knowing which ewes they came from, and in a natural multi-sire system, even understanding that twins can be born of different rams but the same ewe. That's all something that we can tell from running your genomic samples through a parentage test. Then understanding the difference between direct parentage linkage and relatedness can be quite important in the genomic evaluation, which is something that can only be achieved by using a 50K sample. And then all of your additional traits that come out, things like pole horn is a really great example because it's a little bit like a light switch. It's either on or it's off. You've either got horns or you don't. You can't necessarily tell that when a lamb is born, but I can tell that from a genomic sample. Then we've got various birth defects, screening for recessive diseases that can also come from that same genetic sample. Closing the loop is actually using all of the results that come out of the genomic evaluations to make specific decisions on your next mating, and then you start back at phenotype collection again. So the example that I've got here is MateCell. That's a sheep genetic service. It may not be as particular as using a software such as MateCell. It may simply be analyzing the data you have at hand and making the best decision that you can. But ultimately, all data recorded in a program such as this needs to be acted on. So if we take out that final step and we're not acting on anything before the next generation is born, then you're really not seeing return on investment for both the time and the money that you've put in. So having that final step in the chain is really important. And then repeating the process on generation builds data accuracy through the flock, builds data accuracy through the breeding lines, and then adds to your return on investment over time. So this is something, as I said, that I'm now working on with the South Australian site for Merino Sire Evaluation, and something that has been, quite an enjoyable and quite a nice streamlined process to run through over the last, I think, 9 months that we've been working together, and sure that we'll be working together in the future years to come. Very much encourage any questions. This is my last slide. I promised I would keep it nice and sharp and tidy for you. And hopefully look forward to seeing all of you at a field day sometime soon, which with any luck, we might be able to host something early next year. That's all for me, Jodie.
Oh, thanks, Bill. Much appreciated. One question, I guess, a 50K sample is maybe something that people are not familiar with. Do you want to just give us a quick summary what a 50K sample is?
Yep, certainly can. So I might just flash my screen back up again. I was just a little bit quick to close it down. So we take the physical sample itself shown on the far bottom right, which is a TSU, which is a tissue sampling unit, pardon the acronym, made and sold by Allflex. This is the physical piece of ear notch that is collected on farm and sent into my lab. That's the inward going component to the laboratory. The outward going component is the data that represents that DNA, and we refer to it as a 50K sample or a 50K result because it is 50,000 individual SNPs of the DNA, 50,000 locations, if you like. A lot of us will casually refer to it as SNPs. SNPs is another acronym, SNP, which is a single nucleotide polymorphism, which really simply we can think of as 1/2 of any pairing within the DNA double helix. So we have 50,000 individual points of DNA analyzed and reported back, which accumulatively is your 50K report. And from that is where we start to analyze 250K reports to look for similarities. Now we have quality control measures for thresholds that must be so similar to prove that they are a sire and lamb, for example. And then as it works its way back from that, we can actually tell that there's zero relatedness because there's no overlap. As your 50K reports go into a genomic evaluation like they do at sheep genetics, we can start to see relatedness, which is not a sire and a lamb, but clearly showing some similarities in DNA. And it is possible in the right scenarios to actually pick distance of relationship. So for example, cousins that we might not be able to pick the direction of relationship, but we can pick that they're only 1 or 2 steps apart within the pedigree.
Fantastic. And the last question, which you can resolve not to answer for commercial reasons, is the cost, which most producers want to know.
Happy to answer the cost because it's the same retail pricing for everybody. That's not a problem. A 50K genomic test is $28.50 plus GST. And then on top of that, you will need to factor in the cost of the tissue sampling unit, which is the TSU itself. You can buy them from the likes of Elders, Nutrien. You can also buy them from myself. Prices are reasonably consistent at approximately $3 to $3.50 each, depending on where they come from. And then obviously the time to collect the sample.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Bill. I'd just like to thank everyone who joined us for today's webinar. Bill and Ben, thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise with us. If anyone's got any additional questions, you can contact us directly using the contact information on your webinar registration. As I said, tonight's webinar was recorded and that'll be available on the Sheep Connect SA YouTube channel, probably early next week. So thank you for your time. Have a lovely evening.